All right, there you go.
Hey everybody, this is the SIG Auth meeting for July 12th. So we have some demos. We have a demo today, we have a little bit of discussion, and then the big item is the 1.8 planning. First off, just congratulations everybody to the 1.7 release. I particularly enjoyed the fact that this SIG was highlighted as one of the big feature shippers, or at least feature hardening items on the release notes. So congrats everybody. So first on the agenda, we have Liz Rice. Liz, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, I just unmute myself. It's a lot of noise.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I think we're good now.
Okay. It says I can't share my screen while the other participant is sharing. So if I could.
1 second. There you go.
Let's see. Share screen.
And just as a little bit of background, I believe this is a tool that integrates with CIS. Yeah.
It exactly is, yeah. So for anybody who isn't already familiar with it, the Centre for Internet Security publishes benchmarks of best practices for keeping your host secure. They recently released this Kubernetes 1.6 benchmark, and there's work in progress on a 1.7 version. And the benchmark includes a whole bunch of tests. Let me kind of click to things like this, where it shows you what commands you should run to check whether or not you're complying with these kind of recommended best practices. So what we've done with Kubebench is basically automate this. So Kubebench is open source, sitting there on GitHub under Aqua Security, and it's a Go implementation that will run through all these different tests for you. You can install it with a Docker image. So it's actually this is a Kubernetes master that I've got here. Yeah,
we're still seeing the PDF, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a shame. I wonder how I change. Thank you for pointing that out. Otherwise, I think I'm going to try stopping sharing and resharing. So let's try that one. Okay, can you now see my terminal? Yeah?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so this terminal is Kubernetes master. I previously ran this installation script. It just kind of pulls down an image and installs the executable and some config files on your host. So the idea is that we have those tests documented in kind of YAML format, kind of like this. So it's easy to update the config files as the new benchmarks as they get updated or as new versions get released. We just have to add different configuration files that define what needs to happen for each of these different tests. Okay, and then all we need to do is run it, and we might say run. The benchmark has a different set of tests for masters, for nodes, and for federated servers. I'll run the ones for master. And it's going to run a whole bunch of tests, tell me how many pass, fail, tell me the remediations, and so on. You can also get this output in JSON formats, so that it's easy to kind of integrate with automation of this kind of testing across your whole cluster. And that's kind of it, really. It's there on GitHub with love, comments, feedback, contributions, anything like that. I thought I'd mention a couple of kind of coming soon and sort of issues with it. So I mentioned earlier that the 1.7 benchmark is going to be released soon, so we'll obviously be updating the tests to comply with that. one thing that we've noticed is depending on the different installation tool, if it's been installed with COPS or kubeadmin or whatever, you get different executables and different config file names. And that kind of doesn't really correspond to what's in the benchmark. So we're making some changes to make it easy to say, actually, this install was done with COPS. This is the set of config file locations that you should use, and other tools. We can actually use some help on identifying what those default locations are, if anyone knows. I'm going to try and find somebody from COPS, maybe Chris Nova, I'm at GopherCon this week. Well, that's basically what it is, and we'd love to see people using it.
Awesome, thanks. Just as a question, have you considered just parsing like a API server manifest and trying to determine the conformance of that rather than looking at specific paths on disk? Because that might help you when doing this kind of stuff.
I think that kind of input would be really useful into the benchmark. So what we've tried to do here is to say, we'll do what the benchmark says. Mm-hmm. And the benchmark has some tests around looking at what's actually, using PS to see what's being executed and looking at the parameters that were passed in that way. And then it also has these checks on things like the permissions and ownership of various config files. And I think kind of pulling that together into something that's really kind of representative of what people have in Kubernetes clusters I think that's still a work in progress. I'm not convinced that the benchmark as it stands really kind of says, and your installation probably looks like this. I think that reflects how some of those file locations and things have been changing.
Awesome. Are there any other questions on this tool? Cool. Just as a general note, the CIS is updating their benchmark for 1.7. I've dropped a link in the agenda items or in the notes for this meeting talking about how you can get involved with that. It's basically signing up for the CIS website and then starting to review some of the items there. Awesome.
Are there folks in this group that are actively involved in CIS benchmarks? Because there's a lot of nuance here that's not reflected in those benchmarks.
Right, and I've got involved, and I am absolutely confident I do not know a lot of that nuance.
I've been reviewing them. This is Jordan. I've been reviewing them and giving feedback and writing some topics. I've not put as much time into it as I would hope, but if other people want to jump in and just look at a couple, I think that would be really helpful. Just kind of spread that out. If you are familiar with one of the sections, kubelet or API server or auth or one of those sections, even just looking at 2 or 3 in depth would be really helpful.
Right, because I think some of these are sort of like, RBAC plus anonymous auth is not nearly as bad as it was pre-RBAC, right? So there's some interactions between these flags that are not as straightforward as I think they were in previous Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jordan.
Well, I'll just drop a little call to action in our meeting notes. Okay. Next, we have Paul Morey talking about the service catalog.
Yeah. So we might have even been the last SIG Auth, maybe not, maybe second to last. Have discussed this before. To recap, the problem we are trying to solve is that in Service Catalog, there are 2 resources that represent different logical concepts in the Open Service Broker API, which is the actual API that we're integrating from Kubernetes 2 with the catalog. And those are an instance of a service, and then a thing called a binding, which is a manifestation of information about how to use a service into pods. And both of these resources need to be able to reference in some way secret information to pass to an entity called a service broker that is responsible for carrying out actions to instantiate a service or to create a new binding. And we talked through several different permutations of how to do that in the catalog SIG. One thing that happened during the 6 to 7 weeks that we've been discussing this is that there was guidance from SIG Auth to stop using references to secret keys from other API resources when the use of that key did not target a pod. And we talked through a couple different permutations of how we could achieve that in SIG Auth. In the past, I spent some time talking to Jordan earlier today and with Clayton Coleman, and we were able to talk ourselves out of using any of those mechanisms and back into using a reference to a secret key from these resources that would hold the set of parameters to pass so that they could contain secret information and piggyback on top of all of the current and future protections to secret data that we have and will have in the future. And what I wanted to discuss today is to get some closure on that and basically describe what I think that we should do and ensure that people feel that it is sufficiently in line with how we will treat the same problem in other API resources and other parts of the system so that we can implement something with confidence. It's very urgent for us to get closure on this. It's needed for a number of different use cases across a number of different vendors. Sorry, someone wants to interject?
So I was, there was a lot of references to secrets of secrets, and just to clarify what the actual problem is, what was the solution that was rejected or not?
So the original solution is something topologically equivalent to from the service instance or service binding API resource, have a reference to a secret and one of the keys of that secret, and have that secret key hold the parameters. The service catalogs controller would would read that secret and use that to form the payload that is sent to the service broker. Alternatives that were discussed were to not use secrets at all and to have a field of these resources that was encrypted in the API server, in the service catalog API server. And then there were a number of very clever ideas that we had about how to make these resources non-escalating. So one example would be to not return this information as part of a get or a list or a watch and give you a special sub-resource on the resource that you would have to do a get if you needed to get the secret information. That's problematic for a number of different reasons. I think that was really the crux of what we had kind of discussed as a possibility. I'm happy to go into what we don't think we like about that.
You may have skipped over the fact that we don't, in general, for all installations, want to grant the ability to list, get, and watch every secret in the system to the service catalog.
Yeah, it's a similar access pattern to Ingress, the Ingress controller, right? Yeah. You have a controller that has a specific job to do things with a specific type of resource, and as part of doing its job, it needs some confidential information that we want to be able to be referenced. So in the Ingress case, it's like the certain key for the route, right? In the service controller case, it's confidential parameters that are input to satisfying the service binding, like a database password or something like that. So it's a very similar problem to what the Ingress controller has.
But that detail right there is why is why you don't just grant full access to secrets, and why you're about to go through and explain what you were thinking about, right?
Yes, that's correct. So the element, the salient point of machinery feature present and past that changes this equation is similar to what we have planned for granting the kubelet the ability to watch individual secrets, which is that there will eventually be a watch mechanism that allows you to watch individual secrets instead of watching the entire resource. And in time, we'd like to use that mechanism to avoid having a controller that had to watch all of the secrets in the cluster. In the meantime, we don't want to build such a controller. So what that means is that if we have API fields that are basically a reference to a secret and a key within that secret, that it will mean that when that excuse me, when the content of that secret changes, that we'll either need to rely on the controller resyncing the resource that references that secret and doing the state reconciliation of, is what I would send now what I've already sent? If it's not, I need to go ahead and send it. So we'll either need to rely on resync or have users make some other change that results in a watch event on the resource that references the secret. And that's not the greatest user experience in the interim, but if we can in the future use a resource by resource or secret by secret watch to avoid having a controller that has the wrong usage pattern, I think it's acceptable in the short term and very much preferable to making resources that have new unusual semantics around secret fields. So since I talked in circles just a little bit, I'll restate what I'm proposing is that in these service catalog resources that we reference a secret and one of its keys, and that the controller that performs actions to fulfill this API not watch all secrets, that it do gets on a case-by-case basis right now and eventually move to use a bulk watch type facility, or I've heard it called book watch, I've heard it called a number of different things, but a instance by instance watch on particular secrets that the controller needs access to.
For those who aren't aware, that is a merge proposal slated for 1.8, intended for use in the kubelet for high scale performance, and it overlaps with a number of requests from other users for the ability to watch multiple resources like web consoles and
I just put a link to that as well.
Yeah, the feature, I got to go find the feature issue. Wojtek did it backwards, but this is a performance core API to make it easier to do something that's very common for a number of clients. So just so folks are aware.
So, but that doesn't address the security issue here. You still,
yeah. So
the plan, 1x1 watch, it still doesn't address the issue that we can't say Ingress can watch all TLS secrets, right? Which would be the thing that we'd want to be able to.
You'd have to grant access to a secret for Ingress, which is the usability issue, I think, that Paul was going to get to. So you'd say, grant the Ingress controller access to this secret.
Right. So this is also
generic. Yeah.
This is also similar to like the problem that there's a custom authorizer for kubelet to get access to the secrets reference from the pod scheduled onto it. It's just another instance of the same problem.
Are we going to end up with the secrets authorizer?
Go
Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, it really depends on the usability aspect, which is if we can't make it easy for you to grant like I create a secret and I create an ingress. Who's making the decision on a cluster by cluster or ingress controller basis, whether you really want this particular secret to be accessed by this particular ingress controller? Could be a set of options. Someone could go do a control, like if you have an ingress controller cluster wide, someone could go we could do a controller that automatically grants access to that and let an administrator say, if someone creates an ingress and they reference a secret, go ahead and grant access to the cluster level ingress controller. Vice versa, if you're more of an adversarial model where you don't necessarily trust that particular extension, we need to make it easy for someone to say, hey, I want to grant access to this guy. And that's kind of an unsolved problem today, even though, like from a usability perspective, just because we don't have CLI or UI that make that easy.
Yeah, it's expressible. It's just fiddly.
Yeah.
And maintenance of it could be an issue. Like we've never really, like OpenShift has gone pretty far down having like UIs and CLI around policy expression. And we've learned a lot of things from it. Only a few of those exist in Cube today. And we can probably take those lessons learned and say like, well, this is a new use case as well. What's the right thing? That's work though to make that happen.
At one point in time, we had considered the idea of putting like intended for or an audience on a secret.
Well, there's a type.
It's not quite the same thing.
I know.
Right? I can have a type. I have a type of a TLS key, but I might have an intent to allow the ingress controller to use it, or I might not. And so the type isn't quite sufficient.
So that would be interesting because then you could have a controller that manages those completely abstract from the user, which is the controller would say, does this controller have this permission by doing an RBAC check? And therefore grant access to this controller to, or this other thing to have access to these automatically. It's kind of an automated denormalization of RBAC, but for small cardinality things that might actually be a very reasonable generic solution.
Yeah, it's something we considered for build a while back, right?
Yeah, the definite worry would be whenever someone adds a new custom extension, API or CRD, we wouldn't want this controller to be like, oh yeah, I found an object reference in this thing, grant access. We would definitely there needs to be expression of intent to use the secret that a user does in a fairly either generic or specific way, depending on whether they trust the extension or not. And maybe this is an admin thing where, out of the box template examples say, hey, here's a secret that you can use with an ingress controller. Give it to an ingress controller that can see things in this namespace, which is enough.
Yeah, both cases exist too. The cluster-wide one where the admin sets up the ingress controller and he doesn't want his users to have to know the subject of the ingress controller. So he wants to say any secret reference by an ingress should be accessible to the ingress controller. But like you said, there's also the user by user where, and you get into this more when you're running sort of partitioned controllers where they're controllers that have access to a subset of namespaces, and you kind of as a user get to opt in and say, oh, I want to use this feature, but in order to do that, I as the user need to allow access to these secrets to this thing. The usability of that, like the feedback loop where I create the object that drives this controller and then it's stuck because I haven't given it access that it needs, thinking through like how that gets surfaced and the user takes action to close the loop on giving that access.
Okay, so here's a dumb question. Why don't we what if we enhanced RBAC so that it actually could just talk about labels, and then we just say, well, secrets with these labels actually opt in?
I would like to see a controller written to do that first that would grant it.
Yeah. The challenge in all the various like musing around this, the problem was doing get, post, update, and delete, and because like list and watch are easy because we can check that at request time. For every other thing, we have to introspect the object, and that means that the authorizer becomes more of instead of the authorizer being request based, it becomes request plus body based. And it also means, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say it gets split across admission, and you would have to enhance admission to also do something like get.
Yeah.
It may be worth it. It definitely, like, I think it raised this could be more complex than we imagined, which is some of like Eric's point about like doing the controller might actually be like a really concrete way to start.
So I'm sensing from a lot of this discussion that we've been talking about this stuff for a long time. There's a bunch of sort of coming at it from the edges, like the service catalog stuff. Is it time to have a really focused, deep discussion and try and sort of really come up with a plan here?
I think so. It's fermented throughout most of 1.7, and
there's just been a lot of sort of scattered stuff, and nobody's had time to really dig into it.
I think the sort of thread on the ingress doc that we opened up, just sort of our concerns about resources or like controllers doing bulk watches on secrets, expresses a lot of the concerns that we have, and maybe formalizing that and saying sort of, so just to give an answer for the service catalog stuff, we definitely don't want the service catalog to have to watch all the secrets in a namespace. Is that fair enough?
Yes.
And then formalizing that, and then we can sort of start working on, okay, if you can't do that, what are the access patterns?
I would almost go so far as to say that security team.
Oh, I think it's you that's loud.
I would expect that security tool, that the first thing I'm going to audit is who has access to view all secrets on a cluster, and it better be like 3 people.
Yeah.
We have to break that now. That is the assumption that we cannot tolerate, no matter what happens.
I have ideas, but I don't think we have time now.
Okay, so if I build an API resource that references a secret and one of its keys, and a controller backing that resource which does not watch secrets, will I pass API review?
That seems like a reasonable thing to do now that lets us move in a good direction going forward and still gives us a limited surface area to grant permissions around however we do it, manually or automatically or even broadly in a cluster where they don't care. You know, if the controller is nicely behaved and you're on a cluster where they actually don't care about subdividing for whatever reason, they don't have to fiddle with any of this stuff. They can just say, you can get any secret and the controller can get any secret. And then in clusters where they do care, they can jump through these hoops or use these tools that we come up with to, you know, partition out, parcel out individual secret access. But the controller doesn't limit your options.
So the problem, I feel like we're pushing the peas around on the plate, because if you're going to do this, Paul, you're going to have something that's automatically going to, you know, manipulate RBAC rules to be able to grant the service catalog access to the correct secrets, and that thing essentially needs, you know, root to be able to do its job.
Well, you could just whitelist for now, though, and say, and then once we develop better patterns.
Yeah, I would be happy to use a whitelist in the interim before we have a more suitable generic mechanism to use.
Like I said, it's expressible today, right? So if today you create a binding and you create the secret and you create the role which gives access to that secret, like, it's expressible, it's clunky, but you can make it work, and you can, you know, use the templates and tools that we have to kind of get through this first phase, and then take those lessons learned about, well, what does it look like when we manage it this way, and how can we kind of make that more usable by things like ingress and other things that follow this pattern.
So my worry, Jordan, is that if this thing becomes so fiddly and so hard to use, people will do it wrong, or they'll just, you know, give access to everything. And so I think without tracing the sort of usability and sort of the user experience around this, I'd have a hard time sort of imagining where it's all going to end up.
Yeah, I think the expression of it actually probably wouldn't change a whole lot. I mean, it's a manifestation of a of the policy and then how you manifest it. I don't know. I think if we start by making sure it can be expressed and then making it easier to express that. I mean, otherwise, what do we do now? Like Paul says, they need to do something now. So what do they do now other than follow this pattern manually?
That's a very compelling argument. What do we do now? Yeah.
So are we all good on, or not good, but can we at least move on to the next item, since we do have another discussion and then the 1A planning?
We're not good. We're great, because we have solved this after many weeks. So thank you all.
Yeah.
Cool. So next on our agenda item is some Kubernetes TLS validation proposal, or is a proposal. Matt, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. So just to introduce myself for a second, I'm new to the community. I spent the last year working at an online bank doing security engineering on Kubernetes, and now I'm here at Heptio with Joe. So Kubernetes is hoping to get it out of beta in the next 2 cycles.
Yeah, we're headed in that direction, yeah.
And one issue that came up recently was sort of comparing what Kubernetes does to Docker Swarm, and specifically sort of the Bootstrap discovery protocol, which is one way of using Kubernetes, but it's the way that's sort of documented as the example flow when you go to Kubernetes.io and you want to spin up a test cluster. The way it works right now is with a symmetric token. You can generate, and that token is just a random byte string. It's used as an HMAC key. So you can generate it ahead of time out of band and spin up servers, spin up your API server, spin up your workers, and they can use that shared secret to sort of at least trust that they all came from the same place. And the idea of doing it that way was that you don't pass any permanent secrets over the whatever kind of orchestration mechanism you got to pass that token in. And that token then can expire after a TTL. So the issue, sort of like one of the issues, is that the tokens by default right now don't expire. Like if you just run kubeatom init, you get a token that has an infinite expiration. And the other issue is that if you're just talking about like sort of 2 parties and they share a secret, they can authenticate each other. But as soon as you're talking about a server and multiple clients and they all just share that one secret, then any client can impersonate the server to another client. So this is something that Docker Swarm avoids. And part of the motivation here is let's harden kubeatom init a little bit so that it basically has the same security model as Docker Swarm. Not that it's going to be perfect, but it's going to avoid that kind of impersonation.
Swarm does not support TTLs either, so like we're that's another mitigation.
So the proposal did go over a lot of those concerns, but the actual proposal was just TLS basically pinning. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah,
so
the actual change is not there. So there's no change. The proposal is that there's no change server side to the discovery API. It stays sort of as is. kubeatom on the client side gets support for two new pieces of code. One piece of code in the join command can accept the TLS pin on the it's a public key pin on the root CA. So if you know your root CA cert ahead of time, you pass that into kubeatom join, and it only trusts servers that are signed by that root. And then I'm also adding some name validation that goes with that. The second piece of code is in kubeatom init. At the end of kubeatom init, it generates an example command for you to copy paste. That example command now can have the key fingerprint added to it.
Right.
So sort of like the 2 cases that I called out in the proposal, one is what Joe called the self-stitching cluster, where you kind of have a very simple orchestration system that just wants to generate a token, spin a bunch of nodes up, and they'll just sort of stitch themselves together. That case, like, it's hard to have a public-private key pair injected into that without passing permanent secrets over
less than ideal channel. Yeah.
Yeah. So the proposal for this thing is basically we're not going to worry about that case. The other use case, which is really like the one that gets called out in the docs for a lot of I think new users, is manually running these kubeatom commands and copy pasting them around. We called that the swizzle case. So we're going to make the swizzle case much more secure. We're not going to fix the self-stitching case. And the other idea is that this mechanism lends itself to, if you have a little bit more complex orchestration capability, in other words, like you're using Terraform or CloudFormation or something that can maybe pass some information around as you're spinning up the cluster and push it through some sort of trusted party. This lends itself to being able to, you can pin in that case too. There's also, I think, other sidebar here, which we talked about in Slack yesterday, is this whole discovery mechanism is still, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, still kind of targeted at the tutorial kind of use case. And that if you're building your own sort of installer, you can still generate a whole.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's just the tutorial case. I would say that it's optional. And if you already have secure mechanisms to pass stuff around, you can leverage that so that you can actually skip all this stuff.
I think that's another piece of getting kubeatom out of beta, is making sure that the pieces of it are usable from a custom installer that can do pass that data around.
Yeah, it feels like we're kind of making the copy and pastable command less and less copy and pastable and closer to like just take this kubeconfig as your bootstrap. At which point you have a bundle and you don't need the symmetric key. I mean, I thought we had talked about actually some of the fingerprinting stuff before, and that was kind of there was resistance to that because it means you can't rotate your CA server side, and like I don't know, the copy and pastable like shared secret bootstrap fills a niche. I don't know that niche is like you're talking about one node with that secret can intercept traffic and act like the server to another node, but it can also just request an identity and be the other node, given the way that it's set up today. So you're right, this does make it more secure, but I'm not sure that this is the path that needs to be made more secure. So
Jordan, I think the node not, I'm going to say node authorizer, not the node authorizer, but the node certificate approver. There is also, ongoing talk and work about being able to use essentially a plugin model for underlying extra data to actually add more data to that, so that it's going to be even more difficult for that node to impersonate anybody. In terms of copy and pastable, I think, our limit here is, we want to keep this under like 80 characters. I think we're still there, I think. We're getting close.
It's well past it at this point.
Really? No,
yeah,
it's just a small signature. I mean, like it's a
SHA-256 hex encoded right now. Like there's games we can play if we really want to make it shorter. Like actually, we probably don't need 256 bits of the fingerprint to be safe. But
okay, but
yeah.
at the end of the day, I mean, we can make this thing optional. Look,
honestly, I don't feel strong. I think I actually suggested a fingerprint originally.
So the reason why I didn't want to do the fingerprint originally is that I still think that the self-stitching scenario is very important. And we've heard from many users that it's much easier to orchestrate and actually bring up a cluster with the self-stitching mechanism than it is to actually bring up the master first and then extract data from that and then provide that to the other ones, right? So if you look at sort of the corresponding like Terraform for the self-stitching scenario versus the swizzle scenario, it's a hell of a lot easier, and you're not passing any long-term secrets over less than ideal channels. And so if we had gone through with only the certificate fingerprint from the get-go, that would have been, we still would have need to do a token for the initial authentication for getting the certificate, right? So we still would have had a token, and we would have essentially, made it so that we couldn't do that self-stitching scenario.
I also want to point out again that the proposal is not about the token, like the authentication token. It discusses it, but the only concrete change in that proposal is to have a fingerprint that you can use to bootstrap the certificate, the CA, right? So just to focus this conversation and
the actual implementation too here is really simple too. It's basically right now the kubeatom join command when it starts up makes it totally unauthenticated, unsafe sort of TLS connection with no validation to get the cluster info config map from the server. So that connection right now is just kind of over unvalidated TLS.
Right. I mean, the validation is the signature on the data.
Yeah. So you get the object back and you check an HMAC with the token that you have. The change that I've made basically is during that initial connection, you save off the certificate chain that the server gives you. And then after the fact, so you still do the same token validation with the HMAC as before, that still is there. But now if you have a CA pinned, you go back to that original chain and check it against the CA, and you learn from that cluster info config map the actual full certificate, whereas you start with just the fingerprint of the certificate. So it means that initial connection, TLS connection you make, gets sort of retroactively validated. Yeah. Anyway, that's the actual sort of code change. I think there's an opportunity, like Joe touched on, like the sort of like plug-in model for node attestation and like being able to plug into something like EC2 identity and use that to authenticate. I think that could be also a pattern for bootstrapping the client's trust of the server too. If we can have the server have some out-of-band a tag or something on EC2 that asserts that that's the master, and I'm interested in exploring like how we can build a pluggable bootstrap that can rely on that kind of data.
Just because we have 15 minutes, does anyone have any final? Thank you for the proposal. I think that is it cool if we just continue to discuss it in the actual proposal, and maybe at a future SIG Auth.
I think the final parting thought I want to leave here is that this is in some ways reactionary, just because we want to make sure that we are, we have an option that is as secure as Swarm, to be honest. I don't think this is a super serious attack vector. It's not something that I'm losing a lot of sleep over, but it is going to be something that could be a sort of checkbox sort of talking point if we don't address it.
Yeah, and as TLS rotation does go into beta, I think that we'll have to continue to have these conversations. So as that moves forward, that might be a good mechanism to continue talking about this. Cool. So the next item we have on our agenda is the 1.8 planning. Liggett, do you want to go ahead and talk about that? Jordan?
Sorry, I was muted. Sure. In the few seconds we have left, this wasn't really intended to be like a full planning meeting. This was more a chance for people to indicate what they are working on, so that we don't duplicate work, so that people are aware if they are interested and want to help, or have things to contribute or feedback. So I added a couple things at the beginning that I am planning to work on. Other people added other things, and I took a stab at putting names beside them. So if I got the names wrong, please correct them or add other people, just so we can get a sense for who's doing what. And I know there were a couple things, the container identity working group and the secrets roadmap pieces. were bigger kind of ongoing chunks of work. So those are probably things that we will have other meetings other than the normal SIG Auth meetings for, especially the container working group. So I know Clayton is just getting that organized. But were there other things that people are working on, have in progress, didn't make 1.7, but they're continuing to work on in 1.8 that are not on this list? Just so we can kind of get the picture of what 1.8 looks like. I mean, the stuff we talked about with Paul, with the secret access controller pattern stuff, that I'm not sure if that falls into the secrets roadmap or not. It might partially, but it feels distinct. A lot of the secrets roadmap stuff is about encryption and external integrations, not necessarily about access patterns by controllers, though it's certainly relevant.
I had one that's not on here that probably goes into the secrets roadmap, which was, and I had opened an issue about storing secrets in etcd actually at a certain size and scale of cluster becomes very bad. So it's not really, I don't think it affects most people. Anyone with less than a few hundred namespaces is probably not affected, but at very large scales, putting the CA into the secret rapidly leads to very, very large amounts of memory being used for data that's absolutely the same across the entire cluster. So that I open an issue, I'll link it in here at some point.
And that was some of the stuff we were looking at experimenting with modeling it as on-demand injection via like a volume plugin, flex volume plugin, or something that something like Vault could tie into, or something that requested like a service account token on demand, so that it actually never lived in etcd. It was just generated in place, requested in place, and then injected.
Yeah, and the container identity stuff might overlap, because honestly, very little difference between the controller identity and the service account token. If you think of the service account token as being a non-pod specific or non-container specific token, but what we really want is the service account, the container's identity to be this container in this pod, on this node, in this namespace, using this service account. And so that may actually be the, that may reduce some of the issues, but we have some backwards compatibility issues. We couldn't just change it without affecting existing apps.
Oh, and as a shout out for like cross-sig work, some of the SIG storage folks are looking at making flex volumes able to be dynamically added to a node, so that you could deploy a new flex volume plugin like with a daemon set and have the kubelets pick it up. So if we wanted to prototype some of these things with volume plugins, that might be getting a lot easier in the next month or so.
I had just a generic question about what RBAC to V1 items are. Do you have any specific things you're thinking about, Jordan?
Actually, I didn't. The beta API has been pretty low feedback. The things that we think we want to do all seem to be bigger scoped changes that seem like they would be additive rather than like fundamental changes to the current structure. So from my perspective, this is largely a mechanical change, so we can get a release and then next release start storing V1 and probably deprecate V1 Alpha 1.
I know when RBAC was at 1.6, Cube up had RBAC turned on and then turned off again, and there's been some bouncing and back and forth there. I worry that not enough people are using RBAC at this point for us to really get the feedback and the sort of the runtime that we need. Is there something that we can do to essentially get it used more widely?
So it's been on by default in GCE and GKE and CubeAtom since 1.6. So 1.6, 1.7.
I mean, I worry things like most Helm charts are busted with RBAC.
That could be
has some issues. I mean,
What's that?
So one of the things that I know CJ was looking at doing was actually removing the legacy ABAC policy. And so if that could be masking issues for GCE and GKE clusters. I know with kubeatom, anyone using a kubeatom cluster is running under RBAC. Would we like to get the legacy ABAC policy removed from GCE and GKE for a release before we go to V1?
I mean, it's chicken and egg. I mean,
it is. I know.
I mean, we do hear a lot of I hear a lot of it from sort of the kubeadmin and the AWS quick start that we did. You know, we see a significant trickle of people who sort of really stub their toe on this stuff.
And it's,
I'm not sure what
the audiences are different too, right? Like,
yeah.
If someone is just copying and pasting from a blog post and they want to run stuff, well, they probably want to just make everyone a cluster admin because they don't care. But the person developing a component that's intended for people broadly to consume, they really do need to care about, you know, documenting what APIs they use or providing a role or saying you need to use this built-in role. So, you know, I want to help the people running play clusters. So that might be as easy as, if you're running a play cluster, here's how you just turn all this stuff off. And we have that, right? There's one command you can run that turns it all off and opens it up, but it's not default, and defaults matter. If you make insecure the default, then no one making components will ever make them secure.
Yeah,
so.
I do take a little bit of like, we should be careful about saying things like, well, it's a play cluster, so this stuff doesn't matter. That line is just not bright. And a lot of stuff that starts as kick the tires type of clusters find their way into production.
Exactly.
So yeah, and you know, that's one of the reasons why like we wanted to make kubeadmin, you know, as secure as we could while maintaining usability from the get-go.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I would feel a lot better if, like, say, you know, all the Helm charts actually worked well on our back clusters.
And which Helm charts? I mean, I think taking the examples and things that we have in repo and making sure those work under RBAC. All the ones in our E2Es do, right? Because E2E runs with RBAC without any other policies. So we can try to widen the umbrella of what uses RBAC and works well out of the box. But I mean, once you get beyond like our repo, I'm not sure how far we can go.
So certainly on the Helm charts thing, I think we just should queue this up for Monday's SIG apps meeting and then get that SIG. So I can get that added to Michelle, but I won't be present, so someone else will have to present.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who wants to volunteer for Monday to be at SIG apps to talk about this?
Yeah. I also worry that there's a lot of setups that actually don't turn RBAC on right now. I'm thinking about things like cops.
Yeah, but I mean, there are enough that do, and I mean, given that this is, you know, a clone of what we've been running with for 3 years in OpenShift, and have all of our customers on, like, I think we have enough experience with it to know that this is able to express the types of policy that you need. Are there more powerful ones we want with, you know, labels and field selectors? Sure, but those can be added.
You know, it's really interesting.
No, I'm not worried about the features missing. I'm just worried about the fact that.
Okay, so when I say take it to V1, that doesn't mean it's still totally up to particular deployments to enable it or not, right? Cops can continue running without it.
It's really funny. This is the exact discussion we just had in SIG Apps on Monday about deployment stateful sets and daemon sets, about whether they're ready to go to V1. And it like exactly mirrors it, which was the concern about whether the people using it are actually satisfied versus whether it's sufficient to declare it GA so that people can begin relying on and using it. And like all of the echoes are there. So would we want to, do we need user feedback to graduate to GA? And I think that's like the heart of the other question is, are users successful with it in a way?
I guess the two questions are like, is the product ready to be GA in terms of sort of functionality, and all the experience around OpenShift definitely helps support that. The other question is that, is the community ready to actually have this thing be widely used? And that's a chicken and egg thing, and I just don't know if there's an easy answer there.
I'm sorry, what was the last bit? Is the community ready to have it be what?
So if it's GA, then, I guess there's, and maybe this is just me being a little crazy about this. Like if it's GA, then a lot more people will be using it. And if a lot more people will be using it and they have a bad experience, like, what does that actually say about the product as a whole? And I don't think there's an easy way out there. So I think maybe sort of like GA has to come first, and then like the rest of the world adjusts. But like there will be some time where people will be turning on RBAC more and more often because of GA. That's a good thing. But then they'll also be taking, old advice on how to do stuff and then be confused, and it'll appear broken and they'll have a shitty experience. Yeah. And I think that we just got to take the lumps there, probably.
I mean, I certainly am at the point where if, like, do we feel like maybe like this is like the Canvas checklist for, it's not required to go to the API v1, but it's something that every SIG should be able to answer about the feature is, the moment it becomes GA, the expectations rise on how have we, as a SIG, done a great job of communicating RBAC and have examples and have that. And I think that's very reasonable to spend time on.
Yeah, and I think as we look at things like, as we define conformance and what is a secure cluster, the more we tighten that stuff down, it's going to be, like at some point we will be saying that if you're not running Kubernetes with RBAC, you're probably doing it wrong. And that's a whole nother thing past V1. And as we do that, we want to make sure that the rest of the community is lined up around that. Yeah. Oh yeah, I think that's decoupled from calling the thing GA. All right, sorry. thanks for working with me here. I think.
Well, I think saying GA comes with a whole bunch of baggage. We should probably say, what does it take to graduate the API to V1?
Yeah, I mean,
right, which is different from what does it take to say that like everybody is lined up around it, which is a different bar.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, and honestly, our API guarantees around beta APIs are strong enough that we would have to support the beta API anyway. I think it really is around like API stability. Are there tweaks or changes around V1? And then, like you say, like a lot of the work is really out of repo work. It's working with SIG apps around Helm charts. And,
my concern is the deployment API itself. It's just that all the sort of like block and tackle and plumbing around sort of all the implications as people start turning this on.
Yeah. So actually, I called out, Eric had gone through and opened a pretty comprehensive issue around like documentation and stuff. So these are the kinds of things I was planning to be working on.
Okay.
And I'll tag CJ about what the plans for GCE, GKE are as well.
It's good work.
Yeah. All right. So sorry to take all the time on that. If you do have other things that you're planning to work on, add them here or email the list. And we just want to make people aware of what's going on. Do update the features repo, like retag or indicate work that is actually happening in 1.8. I know we need to do that at the beginning of each release just to kind of get a sense for which things are moving forward.
Yeah. And as much as possible, if we could document what the exact sort of items that or try to start documenting what the exact set of items for 1.8 that we're going to work on for these, particularly like what we just did with RBAC. That would be excellent for also helping other people find work. Cool. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So unless anyone has some final comments, we'll call it quits.
All right, thanks.
All right. Bye.